Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I talk about 10 cards with the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they had to be a multi-faction card. For that I compiled a list of all decks the top 10 official Direwolf event or that reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on the point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. The tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For a more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. Usually I take all data from 2017 to 2022 into account, but this is a seasonal episode, which means I will only use tournament results from one specific season, in this case 2021. Multi-faction cards, meaning cards that include influence from at least 2 factions in their cost, have been important since the beginning of the game, and they are one of the main reasons for the small amount of mono-faction decks in competitive tournaments. The decks of the 2021 season are not an exception to that. It was still heavily impacted by all the high influence payoffs that Set 9, Arch and Devs, and the subsequent Awakening campaign introduced back in mid to late 2020. Those payoffs heavily incentivized 2-faction decks that focused on one of their factions, a type of deck that was still well represented in 2021, as you will see in this video. But that season also saw some decks with 3 or more factions, and one 3-faction card was able to make this list, despite cards generally being more niche the more factions they need. As always, feel free to write your guesses about which cards make the top of the list, or your questions about how close some cards that you expected to see missed out in the comments below. And with that, let's begin. First up, we have Seal Cabal Strongarm. She's a 2-power, triple shadow and 1 fire influence rare 5/1 unit with decay and plunder, and whenever a unit with 5 or more attack, including herself, dies, you play a 1/1 bat with flying and lifesteal. She was released in the aforementioned Set 9 Arch and Devs in 2020, but she didn't really see widespread play until 2021. In Expedition she, like all of Set 9, was only legal for the first tournament of the year, but it was enough to get 16 tops, including 2 top 8s. Most of those tops came from FPS token decks with the Cruel package, a group of cards that will come up a lot in this video. The central card was Cruel Xumuk Occultist, who deals damage to you equal to your open power when you draw her, which then triggers a second effect to play a unit from your void that costs equal to or less than the damage dealt. Back then that unit was also not exhausted like it is now. That means you could summon units from your void without paying any power by just taking some damage, which was especially strong with efficient cheap units like Seal, because you could get those back if you drew Cruel with just 2 or 3 power up. Cruel was so good that people played Know When to Hold Them and Whispering Wind to consistently draw her. Those decks usually played a lot of 3-cost cards, but nothing that costs more than 3 except for Cruel, so that they would always draw Cruel when they discarded a 3-drop with Wind. In Throne, she didn't make it into the FPS token decks because better options existed, but she was a centerpiece of one of the best Throne decks at the end of the season, Stonescar Seal. That was a mid-range deck that could go for aggressive starts with turn 2 Seal if you had a shadow symbol, and cards like Champion of Chaos, but it could also outgrind other decks with cards like Taspu and 3-card advantage from Cruel and Xo. Xo back then used to draw Treasure Trove as a fade effect, so when you just drew the Xo. So he was 3-card advantage, especially if you blundered him with cards like Seal or Exploit, or marketed him away, then drew him from the market again, and so on. On rank 9, we have Prowling Amarek. It's a 2-power, 1 primal and 1 fire influence rare 2/2 unit. On summon, you can either give it Aegis or Quick Draw, and whenever you attack with exactly 2 unit, it gets +1 attack. Amarek was released in Set 11 Revelations, 2 tournaments into the season, and made an immediate splash in the first Throne ICQ it was legal for, back when it still got +2 attack whenever you attacked with exactly 2 units. It even spawned a completely new deck, FTP Acro, in combination with 2 other strong aggressive cards from Set 11, the Angela Houndmaster and Malagar's Amphitheater. While that deck died out, thanks to some nerfs after the Throne ICQ in June 2021, Emmerich still saw play in Skycrack Acro, and to a lesser degree in Skycrack Yetis afterwards, even after it got nerfed in early September. In Expedition, Emmerich was also played in Acro decks, most importantly Skycrack, FPS, and in the ICQ winning FGP Acro list from the player Carnage. Next up, we have our first spell, Stand-in Ancient. It's a 2-power, 1-time and 1 Shadow Influence uncommon fast spell that can kill an enemy unit or relic with 1 or less factions. It was released in the Bastion Rising campaign at the end of 2020, which means it belonged to set 9, so it was only legal for the first Expedition ICQ in 2021. It managed to get even one more top 10 seal there, 17 in total. Most of them came from the second most represented deck of the tournament after FPS tokens, 4 and 5 factions Ling. That deck was built around its namesake card, Sling of the Chi, so it included a lot of units with 6 or more attack and 6 or more health. But contrary to Throne Sling decks, it didn't stick to Skycrack because important incentives for deep influence like Rost were missing in Expedition. Instead, it went for light influence and 4 or 5 factions, and Stand-in Ancient was a great addition to the removal arsenal of a deck like that, although usually only at 2 or 3 copies. Additionally, Stand-in Ancient was played in Xenon and TPS Mandrakes and TGS Midrange in Expedition. In Throne, it mostly saw play in different variations of Xenon. The mix of efficiency and flexibility made it the best removal option for that faction pair, and a welcome addition to Xenon Midrange, Xenon Katra, the later combined with either Marist Mandrake and some ultimate cards, or with the classic Reanimator package including cards like Asindel Revealed. On rank 7 we have the 4th 2-cost card in a row, Janitor Dovid I. He's a 2-power, 1 primal and 1 justice influence 4/3 promo unit. On summon, he draws a soldier or amplify card from the top 5 cards of your deck, and when he dies, your opponent gets to play 2 stunned 2/1 soldiers. He was released as a promo for set 10 in January 2021, which means he was legal for almost the entire Expedition season of that year. His immense deadline, until September 2021 he was still a 4/4 instead of a 4/3, coupled with a strong draw effect, easily made up for the negative Entomb effect. He was of course an obvious addition to, and also one of the main reasons to play, soldier decks in Expedition, with an about even representation of TGP and Horror variants. But he was also played in some aggressive lists without an explicit soldier focus, most importantly the aforementioned ICQ winning FGP Acro list from Carnage, which only played 18 soldiers and no amplify cards, which meant Dovid would only draw a card in about 75% of cases. In Throne, he was only played in Horukira, which played even less hits than Expedition FGP Acro, often only 3 to 4 copies of Marvelous Tundras, but his board presence in the early game was enough to make him a staple in the deck. The nerf to a 4/3 statline in September made him a lot easier to kill with damage-based removal like Torch, and a lot easier to block though, which led to him not getting any tops at all in both formats since. Next up we have Ken Waste Smuggler. He's a 3-power, 1 fire and 1 shadow influence, rare 2/2 unit with decay, and, like all smugglers, you can swap a card in your hand for a card with at least one of the smuggler's factions from your market when you summon the smuggler. The smuggler cycle was released back in 2018 and 19, but many of them went through big changes throughout the years, including Ken Waste. He got decay instead of shift 3 in set 9, which was mostly a buff, but thanks to a very strong 2021 season, the 3/2 decay version was deemed too strong by Direwolf and nerfed down to 2/2 in September 2021. The main reason for that nerf was a staple status in the aforementioned Stonska Seal deck, which wanted at least 8 ways to access the market to consistently gain card advantage with Xo and Cruel, which both had fade effects back then, and people preferred Ken Waste over Current and Merchant because of the better stat line, coupled with the ability to also draw fire cards like Boar, and a Xo that you put away in the market earlier. At the same time, shortly before it got nerfed, he was also heavily played in the more aggressive fire-centric Stormscar decks with cards like Jack Mercenary Hunter and Bouton Death's Reach. And lastly, his third main home and throne was the aforementioned FPS token deck at the start of the season, which I'll talk about more later. After the nerf to Ken Waste, he stopped seeing play for the rest of 2021, but it was mostly in part due to other nerfs to Stormscar Seal and not a good deck existing for him. I also shortly want to talk about the 3 other smugglers that had significant success in 2021, which I only included the ones with at least 5 tops. First up we have Rhyme Conclave Smuggler, who got almost all of his points from staple status in Horukira. Until the big balance patch in early September 2021, he was a 3-2 instead of a 3-1, which was a very solid stat line for a merchant, especially coupled with the fact that he usually had and gave you an Aegis, which worked very well with a copy of Bring to Justice in the market. Next up we have Blight Pass Smuggler. Similar to Ken Waste, she was a staple in FPS token decks at the start of the season because she could cycle Cruel in and out of the market, but she was also played in a few different Felon decks, for example Felon Dredge or Felon Midrange. And the last smuggler with at least 5 tops in 2021 was Howling Peak Smuggler. She was also played in FPS token decks, but not quite as often as Ken Waste and Blight Pass, because she couldn't grab shadow cards. Instead, she made most of her points in Skycrag control decks, centered around Garden of Omens, and Skycrag Midrange, which was one of the most popular decks for the extremely competitive Last Chance Invitational right before the World Championship Finals. Dark Revenger even won the Invitational with the deck, which got him a place at the World Finals. On rank 5, we have our only 3 faction card on the list, Display of Menace. It's a 3 power, 1 fire, primal and shadow influence uncommon fast spell with 3 effects from which you have to choose one on activation. You can either deal 1 damage to each enemy, kill an enemy relic and give all relics in their void bound, or you can sacrifice a unit to draw 2 out of the top 4 cards of your deck. As you might expect, it got almost all of its throne points because it was a staple in FPS token decks. The main difference between the throne and the earlier mentioned expedition variant, next to the better power base, better market access thanks to smugglers, and generally better cheap units than throne, was the existence of Brax's Trove. Trove, which was not a once per turn effect back then, would allow you to consistently find either Cruel or Broken Contract by just playing any 1-cost unit, because Trove decks played Know When to Hold Them as their only 1-cost spell. Cruel or Contract, which you drew with Know When to Hold Them, would then play a 2-drop, which immediately triggered Trove again, to either play Defile if there was a target on the enemy board, and if you played it because not all lists play Defile, or Devour from your deck. The spell that came next, after you played a 3-drop, was usually Display of Menace, because the flexibility of 3 situational but strong modes made it a great card. The Draw 2 mode was the default option that you took when the other 2 modes weren't great. The deck had a lot of small units that you could sacrifice, so it had almost no cost, and looking 4 cards deep into your deck made it a lot better than a normal Draw 2 effect. The first mode could kill 1 health units in a mirror match, like Grenadin, Drone or Kato, but it was also useful against Horukira because it could sometimes kill units like the Namesake card, and against the second most represented deck in the first Throne ICQ, even fell midrange, because it could sometimes kill a Kanta. The Relic removal mode was good in a mirror match as well, because it could kill the opponent's Brax's Trove or Shrine to Carvet, which is usually played in the market, but it could also slow down Skycrag Sling decks quite a lot by killing their Namesake card. All that flexibility made it a staple in the Throne FPS token decks, with and without Brax's Trove, and in the Expedition version of FPS tokens. It was only legal in Expedition for the first ICQ, because it was part of the Set 9 draft pack, but it managed to be part in 26 out of the top 64 decks, most importantly in the aforementioned FPS tokens, but also in some 4 and 5 faction Sling decks, and as a staple in FPS Tessa and FPS Overloader, the 2 decks that met in the finals of that ICQ, in the hands of M. Gallop and Watchwolf 92. Next up is Open Contract. It's a 1 power, 1 fire and shadow influence uncommon spell that kills a unit with cost 4 or less, and then it reduces the cost of each unit in the owner's deck by 1. It was released in the Shadow of the Spire campaign, which belonged to set 8, which meant that it wasn't expedition legal anymore in 2021, but it still managed to get 47 tops in Throne alone. It was played in either the main deck or market of almost all decks that included both fire and shadow influence, because it was one of the most efficient removal options available. The downside of reducing the cost of cards in the opponent's deck could occasionally backfire, but the sheer efficiency of being able to kill anything up to 4 cost, which was basically all competitively played units at the time, was more than worth it. Against even-handed golem decks, who used to draw 2 cards back then, like the aforementioned even fell midrange deck that was very popular in the first Throne ICQ of the season, it could even be an upside because it changed the cost of units in the opponent's deck from even to odd, which made Golem malfunction, like he couldn't draw cards anymore. It was a staple in the market of FPS token decks. The versions with Brexus Trove decks couldn't play it in the main deck because they wanted to guarantee that Brexus Trove always played no one to hold them as first spell, while the variants without Trove had an about even split of market versus main deck use of Open Contract. After FPS tokens fell out of favor thanks to multiple nerf, Contract was added to the main deck of Stonescar Seal and Stonescar Acro decks, usually at 4 copies. In Stonescar Seal, it even managed to sometimes replace Torch, a card that was irreplaceable for most of its existence. We make a small jump in points to rank 3, Combust. It's another 1-cost Stonescar spell with a very simple effect. You sacrifice a unit to kill an enemy unit. It has been around since the start of the game and was playable in a lot of formats, but 2021 was its best season, both in terms of tops and points. Most of those came from the decks that I talked about plenty in this video already. In Throne, Combust was a market, and in non-Trove variants occasionally main deck card in FPS token decks, and later sometimes played in the market of Stonescar Seal decks. In the first Expedition ICQ, it saw play in FPS token decks, usually in the market, and also in the market of FPS Tessa and FPS Overloader. But in contrast to most other cards on this list, it was also legal in Z11 Expedition, where it couldn't shine quite as much as in Z10, but it managed to get some tops in the Vinecrafter market of FPS Acro and in the Rustcrafter market of FGS Valkyries. Rank 1 and 2 are probably obvious now for anyone who played competitively in 2021. The first of those two, with a 40-point lead on Combust, is Grenahan. It's a 2-power, 1 primal and shadow influence uncommon, 1 free unit with lifesteal, and on summon you draw a spell that deals damage, or any unit from the top 3 cards of your deck, and bottom, or before the nerf in June 2021, discard the rest. Hen was released in the Stormbreak campaign exactly 3 days before the first ICQ of the 2021 season, which was held in Throne format. Together with the card on rank 1, which, spoiler alarm, was also part of the same campaign, Hen put all competitive players into panic because those 2 cards were so strong that it completely changed the format with just 3 days left to figure out exactly how it was changed. The most obvious and consequently most represented deck in that first ICQ was even Fellen midrange. Grenahan was an absolute staple in the deck and a big reason for its success, culminating in 4 spots in the top 8 and a mirror match in the final, which was won by the Boxer. As long as you played enough hits for Grenahan, it was at worst a 2-power 1-3 with lifesteal that drew a card, which was already great, but the fact that it discarded the other cards before the nerf in June 2021 made it really insane. Back then, Felraug, the Outcast's Void effect, didn't cost any power, so you could play Grenahan on turn 3 or 4, draw a unit with it, and then discard a Felraug, which you could play for free assuming you had to influence, which was not that difficult. We already had a lot of dual power cards back then. The discard ability also came in handy in the other Throne deck, in which Hen was heavily played in, FPS Tokens. Because that deck wanted a lot of units in the Void for Kato, to make a summon effect better, for Krul to have more targets to revive, for Broken Contract you only needed 1, but Hen could still help to find a first unit very quickly, And occasionally those decks played a market copy of Dark Purveyor, which of course also liked more units in the void. After the nerf in June, Granahan barely got any points in Throne, but it was still a strong card that was mostly held back by the fact that Felon just didn't have a good deck anymore. But it could prove that it was still a strong card in Expedition, both before and after the nerf. In its pre-nerf form, which it only had in the first Expedition ICQ, it was heavily played in decks like FPS Tokens, FPS Tessa, where it was especially good because the deck wanted Grenadin and spells that deal damage for its big build-around card aligned to Tesseract, TPS Mandrakes, 4-Faction Sling, and FPS Overloader, where it could help you to find the two main combo pieces, Overloader and Diabolic Machinations. Contrary to Throne, it was still impactful in Expedition after it got nerfed, mostly as a keycard for FPS Aggro, and the heavily played Fel midrange decks of Z11 Expedition. And on rank 1, if you haven't already guessed it by now, we have Crafty Occultist. He's a 3-power, double fire and primal influence, or until June 2021 single fire and single primal influence, uncommon 3/3 unit that discards and draws 2 cards in summon, and then gets flying if you discarded a spell, and plays a 1/1 Grenadin if you discarded a unit. So at worst he was a 3/3 for 3 power that discarded the 2 worst cards in your hand to draw 2 new cards. But at best he could also get flying and play a 1/1 in the process, or, if your hand was empty, just draw 2 cards without any cost attached. Like Granahan, Crafty was released in the Stormbreak campaign and had a huge impact on the first ICQ of the season. He was a staple in FPS token decks, even more so than Granahan, because discarding cards from your hand to replace them with new draws was very good with fate cards like Rule, Broken Contract, and the occasionally played Lumen Shepherd and Mistwell Drake, because you already got the value you wanted out of them anyway and could just discard them for basically free now. Other than that, Crafty wasn't too omnipresent in that first ICQ, but contrary to Granahan, he was more successful throughout the rest of the Throne season. He was a staple in Skycrack Sling, even in the version with Grand Suppressor, Skycrack Control, and Skycrack Midrange. All those decks played at least some copies of Jotun, Hurler, and Xo, both of which would draw a card on Fate back then. Hurler would draw a Snowball, so a 1-cost spell that deals 1 damage, and Xo a Treasure Trove, so a 2-cost spell that draws a card, which meant they offered free discard fodder for Crafty. Expedition had way less free discard fodder, but Crafty was still very impactful there. In the first Expedition ICQ, he was played in exactly the same decks as Granahan, but afterwards they mostly parted ways, only occasionally sharing decks in FPS midrange and aggro. Crafty was an important part of Skycrack midrange, which wasn't quite as successful as Final midrange, but still pretty well represented. Additionally, he was a staple in Skycrack aggro in Expedition, which really liked that he could draw 2 cards with an empty hand, and then he could set up the attack with exactly 2 unit trigger effects of cards like Amarag, the Angela Houndmaster, and Felice all by himself. This marks the end of the 8th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the introduction video and the previous episodes on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.